It was quite an engineering accomplishment, laying out the grades to get up there and going through a whole lot of rock, blasting away and doing it a lot by hand. Um, but it opens the way to a lot of scenic places and opens the way to the top of the mountain. Like I was starting to say, a vertical mile covered in about 25 miles of road, going from the deserts of Tucson to the cool pine forest in Mount Lemmon. And it was a feat to build it. But I want to talk about that, but I also want to talk about the events leading up to that. As long as it took to build the road, there's an even longer history of efforts to get a road built, like about 50 years worth or so, dating back to the 1800s. To me, it's a special place. I know to some people, it's a blight on the landscape, an intrusion, but I think it's fabulous just where it is. And I don't get tired of it, except for the traffic. So going back to some precursors, I'm looking around for people building roads into the Catalina Mountains, and it took a long time. Probably one of the first roads that shows up is, let me get my pointer going here, is related to Fort Lowell, which was established at its Rito Valley location in 1873. One of the first things they did was start finding a way to get to timber to build the fort and for fuel and everything else. So you can see this is an early map, 1883, that shows the Pinery Road. It shows up on an even earlier map in 1876, and it shows the road to the Pinery. And it's exactly where Soldier Trail is now and has been for 150 years. So it hasn't changed at all. Well, it's changed, but the location hasn't. Santa Catalina Mountains, that was kind of the common spelling up until the 1880s or so, when everybody decided Catalina was the way to go. You know, those early days, well, early relative, the late half of the 1800s, people started building roads in the mountains basically for a couple of reasons. One, to get to wood. Anytime you see pinery, that's a tip-off that it's an area where timber can be cut. That's the same concept as Madera in Spanish, a little earlier. So you got Madera Canyon and the Santa Ritas. It's folks were going there to cut trees. Another reason is to go to mines, and there's a lot of that, but there aren't a lot of mines in the south half of the Catalina, so no roads there. And the other way was to get across the mountains, and it's a lot easier to go around them in this case. There are a few other pinery roads that show up, or roads up into the trees, but nothing much. Nothing really took in the Catalinas. Actually, people in Tucson found it easier to go to Madera Canyon. It's farther away for timber, but it was easier to get to. So a lot of the timber coming into Tucson in the 1870s and 80s, more of it came from the Santa Ritas than ever came from the Catalinas. But another reason started showing up in the 1880s, and that was to build roads to get to somewhere for recreation. Hadn't been a popular topic before, but it became more and more about that time. And this is not on the Catalina, it's the base of the mountain, Sabino Canyon. I just like the photos and have that instead. So here's an example from 1880 newspaper article by Charles DeBril Poston, father of Arizona, Poston Butte, Poston Camp, everything else, but talking about, yeah, someday it'll be a summer resort for health. He also has this, his perspective, the Poston Monument's just outside of Florence, so I guess it's the northern view. So unfortunately for Tucson, Santa Catalinas present their posterior and repugnant sides to the view of that ancient and honorable pueblo. That's not a perspective I share. I think it's kind of gone away for people in Tucson anyway. I like looking at those mountains. But throughout the 1880s and 90s, there's this growing urge to get up to the top of the mountains. And it started happening in the 1890s. There's the Mount Lemmon Summer Resort, a place of grandeur in the mountain pines and firs. The first guy to take advantage of that and get something going was named Frank Weber. And in the 1890s, he built a few little cabins and started renting them out to people, anybody that was willing to make the ride up the mountain to get there. I don't think he did a whole lot of business, but it was successful. It became really popular with some people, but it wasn't a road. But there weren't cars then, but there soon would be. 1902, the Santa Catalina Forest Reserve was created, and what soon became the Forest Service took over management of most of the mountains. And almost immediately, the forest supervisor started meeting with citizens in Tucson and the county who wanted him to advocate for a road. And he did. He led a group of folks out to scout out routes, and he came up with these, looked at a few of them, made his cost estimate, which was, could be up to not less than $10,000, which is quite a bit of money then. He also wrote a really long letter to his boss ultimate boss, Gifford Pinchot, the chief forester in Washington, advocating for a road and making several good points. It's the longest letter he ever wrote. I think we've got his letters, we Forest Service. I don't work there anymore, but I still say that. But one thing he pointed out I thought was interesting, he called the shifting culture in Tucson of about 20% of the people who love living there in the wintertime, cool time, but in the summer, they're gone. You go to San Diego or somewhere cooler. The same phenomenon still going on. But one of his arguments, and the people from Tucson, like the mayor, Gast Hoff, and these other folks, was that, if you have a road up to Mount Lemmon, people would stay in town and spend their money in Tucson instead of in San Diego. And in that early 1900s, the Forest Service got going. They had a presence up there. They were smart enough to think rangers should be on the top of the mountain in the summertime and down at Oracle or Tucson in the wintertime. So they had a little cabin there, ranger station. The longtime guy there was named Jim Westfall, and his wife Lita, who are true characters, every bit as this photo shows. They did everything and did it in an interesting way. The little girl in the middle, Pauline Kitt, went on to be an active leader of the Arizona Historical Society. And I think she capitalized on her summers on Mount Lemmon. At the same time, that first decade of the 1900s, they started developing a bunch of people moving up, some people on forest land. Mr. Weber succeeded in getting a homestead patent for like 153 acres or so. And the Forest Service fought him on that and didn't want to do it because they thought this looks like fraud. He's claiming this is agricultural land, but rumor has it as soon as he gets a patent for it, he'll start dividing it up and selling it to other people, which is exactly what he did. And we have Summerhaven. So in that 19 teens, you had both the forest land renting out recreation residence sites and Summerhaven selling sites for private owners. But the net result is a lot more people were getting up the mountain or wanting to get up the mountain and wanting to get up the mountain in an easier way, like a vehicle. It's the same time you're starting to get more and more cars and more agitation for motor vehicle routes, not wagon roads, but car routes. But at the time, that wasn't an option. There was no road. Nothing happened of that 1905 investigation other than it kind of launched a decades-long pattern of the county and the city leaders and the Forest Service all strongly supporting having a road there, but all looking to somebody else to provide the money. Yeah, that sounds great. You come up with the money, we'll do it. That's everybody's line. But in the meantime, most people got up there packing up from the mouth of Sabino Canyon, a guy named Tom Nagy leading trains up there, which is great. People just haul up the stuff they wanted for the summer and come back at the end, but not satisfactory for everybody. So another 10 years later, we got the same basic scenario of another pressure to do something, another group heading out to do extensive reconnaissance, going out in the field. Same thing, the forest supervisor being a part of it, the county commission supervisor, Cochran, and Engineer Matthews from Espy. I don't know how many of you know Espy. It took me a little while to figure it out, but everybody in Tucson in the early 1900s knew that Espy meant the Southern Pacific. Not to be confused with the Espy Awards. But this trio went out and did a reconnaissance. They checked out, I was going to say that also included Ranger Westfall was part of that group, the guy we saw on the porch there. So that May 6th newspaper, he was part of the group. 3 days later, he's resigned. Something happened on the trail there. He actually left the Forest Service and went to Summerhaven, set up a sawmill, and he and Lita built and ran the Mariposa Inn. So he went over to the public side of the equation. But anyway, they did their reconnaissance, they made a report, reviewed it. This was made to the Mount Lemmon Road Committee. This is at a time, 1915, the mid-teens, there are all these good roads associations forming throughout the West, people banding together to make proposals for new highways, new roads, new byways, and getting their public representatives to work on it. They checked out 6 different routes and decided Sabino Canyon was the way to go. Sorry. And they did a map. It's a little, it's been folded a few times. But they laid out the route all the way from the picnic grounds, which was the end of the road in Sabino at Rattlesnake, where Rattlesnake Creek comes in. Following the trail more or less, but going up all the way, climbing steep up through here, Pine Canyon, Box Camp Canyon, all the way to Soldier Camp. And it sounded great. And they decided that it could all be done for $100,000. They went back to Tucson, and the Luncheon Club and all these other civic groups agreed that was fabulous. They endorsing, overall it was a $400,000 bond issue, but 100 of it, a quarter of it, was for the Sabino to Soldier Camp Road. That's their route that they picked. I'm sorry, I'm trying to switch back and forth between screens. So 1915 was kind of this peak of Mount Lemmon fever in Tucson. Everybody was excited about it. Here's an ad for real estate at Summerhaven. Here's, Frank Weber got his homestead finally. So as the Forest Service suspected, he immediately started selling it off. It was a veritable fairyland. So who could blame him? Trout flow through the tract. Everything's wonderful. Even I love this ad from Steinfeld's. This is the big store in Tucson, but Mount Lemmon sports suits for the girls, for the misses, that they're made so they laugh at the efforts of bushes and brambles to tear them. They are scientifically the right skirt for perfect freedom of action, and only $750. Would that they were still around. And there was a lot of movement behind it. So they got a ballot on the ballot issue. It was like the only issue on for a bond election was specifically for the Mount Lemmon Road, yes or no. The Daily Star was a big advocate for it then, and they ran little notices like anybody needs transportation to the polls, we can arrange that for you. And it passed. It got through easily. I got through, but there was a little problem. It hadn't really been surveyed by anybody, whether forest supervisor, the SP engineer, and a county supervisor, none of whom had any road expertise. The Forest Service said, well, we need to survey it. And they got their roads engineer from Albuquerque down. And he went out and made a detailed survey and a number of culverts and cuts and fills and everything, and said, it's not going to cost $100,000. My best estimate is, I think, $346,000. So that threw a little monkey wrench in the plans for that $100,000 bond, which passed. And it left everybody scrambling with what to do. And the Forest Service, up to the chief forester in Washington, got together and tried to think of a plan. And their idea was, well, let's transfer that to option 2, which is the north side, going from Oracle to Soldier Camp. Advantage there was a lot of it had already been built because there were mines there. A road up as far as Apache Camp. That left like 7 miles that had no road whatsoever, the steepest 7 miles. But they got approval for it, and the Bureau of Public Roads let a contract, and it went through. And in 1920, it opened up for the first time. It's some nice, I like this bridge engineering. I don't think you're going to see those very many places anymore. And this I have to say is not on the Oracle Soldier Camp Road. It's nearby. It was a road Forest Service built to the Oracle Ranger Station, but I just like the photo showing the method. We're using a Fresno scraper, but this pair of big white mules, whoever owned them had to be proud of them. They are handsome. And in 1920, it made it so people for the first time could drive to the mountain. And they did. People that had cars and had places to go there. And everybody was happy, except that it was still a long way to go and still slow and rough. And that 7 miles in particular was narrow enough and steep enough that it could only be one-way traffic. So they worked out this elaborate system of you can go uphill for this 1.5 hour period, and you better make it up in an 1.5 hours. 7 miles to go in an 1.5 hours doesn't seem like a challenge, but it was. And if you don't do it, there are serious fines if you don't make it. There's one car that didn't make it, but otherwise not. And so it became known as, because of these controls at both the top and the bottom, was the control road. And that's the name everybody still calls it, even though the controls have been gone for a long, long time. Now they're just locked gates that get locked when it snows too much. But that didn't satisfy everybody in Tucson. They still wanted a shorter route up the south side, one where you didn't have to go all the way into Pinal County and Oracle and take 4 hours to get there on a rough, nasty road. So there was more renewed pressure to build a road up the south side. And again, biggest proponents probably the Lions Club, but a lot of other civic groups pushing for it. They got it on the ballot again in 1928, but by this time the Star had switched away. The Citizen was a big proponent, but the Star was not. So they hired their specialist, went out and said it's going to cost $1 million plus to do it, not 100,000 or 300,000. Things have changed. The advocate said, no, we can do it. So it went to a bond election. Here's the headlines from election day. You can see the Star's dictation is vote no on the Mount Lemmon bonds and everything else except for repealing laws. And a day later, news headlines: Hoover got elected by a huge majority, but second headline: Mount Lemmon road bond issue defeated in landslide. Yeah, landslide vote, not the road in a landslide. That could happen sometime. So it didn't stop. They kept on going and proposed it again for 1930 bond election. And Lions kept up going with it. They came up with some creative fundraising. They held dances, but the best one, they had a couple of toad races, which were horned lizards, Phrynosoma races, but I don't think anybody called them Phrynosoma. But it was great fun, and everybody got involved. Star and the Citizen and everybody in town. You know, here's a Star editorial and say, you know, although the Star is not in favor of the movement for which the race is sponsored, that of a new short road, the race is great. $5 entry fee, cash prizes for the winner. Everybody could have a toad. They set out a 50-foot circle, put the lizard down in the middle, and then timed it to whoever got to the outside of the circle fast was the winner. They had a whole set of elaborate rules. One of them was no coaching allowed. Just too bad. Would have been fun to hear. The Star's entry was named Lemonade. Then on a little less frivolous front, the guy that also became a major advocate for the short road, the South Road, and a much more effective one was this guy, Frank Hitchcock, who was, he'd been around a long time in government, is a longtime member of the Republican Party. He started out working in DC government bureaus in the 1890s, but he became friends with Teddy Roosevelt, and with Teddy in Theodore's administration, he became assistant postmaster general. And his kind of peak time of fame was in 1908. He became the head of the Republican National Committee, and he became William Howard Taft's campaign manager, steered him through the convention and to the presidency. Taft was Roosevelt's hand-chosen successor, although he quickly changed his mind and 4 years later ran against him because Taft had undone a whole lot of the conservation efforts that Roosevelt held near and dear to his heart. But Hitchcock stayed in politics. He was campaign manager for a number of other people. Most of them lost. He was busy. But he was well acquainted with Republican bigwigs, including Herbert Hoover. He started drifting to Tucson and he bought a controlling share of the Tucson Citizen in 1928 and kind of moved here about 1930 and got active locally. Again, he was the head of the Arizona delegation to the Republican convention that nominated Hoover for a second term unsuccessfully. He campaigned for Hoover. He sent the first airmail delivery from Tucson was a letter he wrote to Hoover. So they were buddies. Hoover lost big time and he was unhappy. And Hitchcock had been working, he was a lobbyist extraordinaire. He'd been working with the Forest Service locally, the supervisor of the Coronado for the road and the regional foresters, and they were both on board with it, trying to talk the Bureau of Public Roads into it. They got it listed as a forest highway, or Forest Highway number 33. It was on the books, but there wasn't any money for it. So it was like down the road sometime, when we have money, we'll do it. That wasn't good enough for Hitchcock. So in the spring of 1933, between Roosevelt's election and the inauguration, he flew to Washington and spent some time, met with Hoover, got his approval, met with the director of public roads and of the prison bureaus, and hatched this scheme of how about we get together and prisons can provide labor, public roads can provide the engineering expertise and things, and we can build this for practically nothing. And it worked. In the last week of Hoover's tenure, they came up, this agreement was accepted for this cooperative thing with mainly with the public roads and the prison bureau. We'll create a new prison camp number 10 in the country, that will provide a labor for building the new road. Hoover came back and went through Phoenix, talked to the governor and said, no money from you, so you're okay. Everybody was okay with it. And it happened. The other achievement he made at that same time in his lobbying in the spring of 33 was to get the creation of Saguaro National Monument. And that happened like 2 days before Hoover left office. So they had in mind the prison camp. The prison camp is a designation for the least secure, least restraining of prison facilities. They're penitentiaries, federal prisons, everything else. But the prison camps are ones where they have very little, no bars, no fences, no nothing. They were looking for only genteel convicts, and they just kind of evolved through time. But the notion was to get people there. Everybody is somebody who is convicted of violating a federal crime, but nonviolent and not a big threat. Supposedly not a big threat to escape, but a lot of them did. Through the whole history of the camp, by far the biggest group of prisoners were Mexican border jumpers, or wet Mexicans, as they called them at the time, guys that got caught crossing the cross, got thrown in jail. They originally staffed it with guys coming from, they'd been in county jails, whether it was in Tucson or Southern California, but they took guys out of county jails and brought them to the new prison camp and started working on the road. Next biggest group was guys caught selling liquor to Indians, which read about one in Tucson. Some guy sold two bottles to a Adam guy for $1, got caught and sentenced to 6 months, I think, in prison doing labor. Didn't seem worth it. So the first camp they did was not where prison camp is now, the Hirabayashi campground, or at the bottom, but it was at the Boy Scout camp up on top of the mountain. And the reason for that was a piece of road that had already been staked out and already started work on it with the emergency fund relief measures to connect the Boy Scout camp with soldier camp, the end of the road. That's something the leader of the Boy Scout group, Hazel Showers, had been pushing for several years, pushing the state, the county, the Forest Service, anybody that could do it, and the Forest Service was doing it. So it was already in operation. So that summer, the Boy Scouts stayed home, and the Prison Bureau took over the camp, the tent camp. And they started working on that stretch of road. They had virtually no heavy equipment, so it was all picks and shovels and wheelbarrows. There's a fuzzy picture from the newspaper, sorry, but this is the wheelbarrow brigade, this whole line, double line of guys with picks and wheelbarrows roughing out this road. So they spent this first summer doing that before they moved to the bottom of the mountain, where the Prison Bureau had been working on building a bigger camp on private land near the bottom of the road. And that gave them time to start surveying the bottom pieces of the road in detail and getting it all laid out. So when the prisoners came down, they could go right to work, starting out right at the bottom, and they did. Again, that's some serious rock to be attacking with picks and shovels that they were doing. And at least now they had a rail car to dump material. Hitchcock was still around. He was happy to see it going. He's East Coast guy, so he called this the Catalina Short Line, moving rail line. Didn't go very far, but as long as it progressed, it was good. He didn't stay around to enjoy much more of his achievement through lobbying. He died in 1935, and but it went on without him. But everybody recognized that he was the guy that got it done, got the project going. And they started at the bottom. This is crossing Soldier Creek, and you can get a feel for what that initial road looked like. It's pretty skimpy, pretty narrow, rolling. They'd come back and widen it and flatten it and redo the cuts and fills, put in culverts. But it was a start. And this is after they fleshed it out a little more, did this massive fill all the way through, put in a fancy stone culvert. There's the bottom end of it, 17-foot arch. I mean, they did fabulous stonework all up and down the mountain. They had time. Still doing a lot by hand. But they gradually started getting more equipment. Fleet of Dodge trucks, brand new, showing up at the bottom camp. And eventually power shovel, and dumpsters and everything else. So things got a little speedier, but it was still a slog. They also did just a ton of blasting. Pretty much the whole road is in rock, so they used obscene amount of dynamite. I can't remember the numbers, but thousands, tens of thousands of pounds. Lots of drilling. There's a pile of discarded, worn out drill bits. And some engineering challenges. This is crossing Catnip Canyon, which is the little canyon before you get into Bear Canyon. And that's quite a culvert. Just some of this stone arch work they did. This triple arch. And finally, in 1939, they moved the prison camp to the location they had in mind from the beginning. It worked out with the forest supervisor, Fred Wynn, that the best place would be Vales Corral, which is a flat open spot along Soldiers Creek. Had some water, not enough. But all the time the crews were working on the road, there were other crews, they had a number of the prisoners were working on building the camp here and the features that went with it. So this almost entirely built by prison labor. They just, when they started work here, they hired a carpenter to oversee things, but it was the prisoners did the work. Oh, and that's what it looks like now. Yeah, I'm sorry, I should have given a spoiler alert. Those buildings aren't there anymore. Anybody that's been up the mountain knows that. It's too bad. It was beautiful, but it's long gone. And now it's the Gordon Hirabayashi campground, which is a nice place, but not the same. We also got a photo from the south side looking up Soldier Creek. You can see the highway sneaking up and headed towards Catnip Canyon. Ball field, baseball field at the end, and basketball court, barracks, everything else. It was a lovely camp, except for the people that stayed there. And this is what it looks like now. They also had to, they came in, engineers looked at it and said, recognized immediately, probably the biggest problem was the lack of water. So they had prison crews go over to Bear Canyon and Sycamore Spring and build this reservoir and a pump house and laid out a big pipeline. They had to pump up 500 vertical feet up to the saddle between Bear and Soldier Creek, built a reservoir there. But when the camp was going, they were pumping 25,000 gallons of water a day, which is a lot. And it's not happening now. We also got this lovely sketch made in 1945 that shows it has all the buildings that were extant then labeled. So office at the front end of things, the barracks, dining hall and kitchen at the end, and laundry and power room. They channelized Soldier Creek, lined it with masonry all the way through the camp. It was quite the layout. They also built another bunch of people were working in after 1943, a sawmill that they installed, and that became another big thing. Was the wood involved? They ended up cutting lumber and transferring it to other prison camps, like in Texas. So a little industry with no income. But wood, particularly in World War II, when coal became so scarce, they started collecting and burning more wood. So they had a wood crew of about 20 guys that go out, and they were using about 8,000 cords of wood a year, which is about, average over 20 cords a day. Be a whole lot more than that in the winter and less in the summer. But so these guys the main focus was building the highway, but they were doing a lot of other tasks too. They also had a garden down along the Tanque Verde growing foodstuffs. And so prisoners got shuffled off to a number of different places. Anyway, they cruised on up. Still, it kept getting longer finish than anticipated, but eventually they were targeting the end of 1947 as the date, and the prison camp was going to shut down and move out and turn the place over to the Forest Service, which is also part of the initial plan to be a Forest Service recreation site. But they got it done in 48, opened it up to the public, had a little dedication for General Hitchcock. There's a You know, a couple of these folks, this guy ran the prison camp for decades, Mr. Mead, C.B. Mead, and this is G.L. McLean, who was the Bureau of Public Roads guy overseeing it for the entire duration. He ended up writing a narrative report about the whole thing at the end of it, which is got a tremendous amount of information in it. We found a niece of Hitchcock to come out. Hitchcock was a bachelor, had no family, no kids of his own. And here's what the memorial's still there, but I'm betting 99.9% of people drive right past and have no idea it's there, Windy Point. And probably a lot of people have never heard of the Hitchcock Highway. And it's become a less commonly used name. You know, another name that came is the Federal Highways Administration proclaimed it to be the Sky Island Byways, and I've never heard anybody use that name in polite conversation. But it opened up, and immediately people started taking advantage of it, using it. As my good friend Pete Taylor used as a title for his thesis that he wrote about this, if you build it, they will come. And that's the spot on prophecy, whether it's from Field of Dreams or Pete's Dreams, I don't know. A slight misquote of Kevin Costner, but that's okay. And, you know, some weekends now it looks about the same with cars a little more modern. And, you know, 1947 was supposed to be the end of the prison camp, but, you know, the Forest Service and the county both realized they had a pretty good thing going. So they came up with money to keep the prison camp there. They spent another 3 years building spur roads and to new recreation sites on the mountain, 18 miles worth or so. So we had 25 miles worth for the main road, which came in under just under $1 million, and a little bit more for this. But they started changing the focus. So the road belt and the spur road belts, they started doing more recreation development. Roads into new recreation residents like Willow Canyon. But they started you know, they had that sawmill going, and lumber and wood shop. They started pumping out signs. Signs so nice that the visitors had a hard time keeping their hands off of them, as you can see. In the 50s and 60s, there was a big push for recreation. Forest Service trying to keep up with the Park Service. You know, the Park Service had its Mission 66, so the Forest Service had its Operation Outdoors. But the net result is they pumped in a bunch of money to developing recreation. And, well, the prison camp was there. They were doing most of the work. The Federal Prisons Bureau kept the camp going until 1967, February. The last 10 years, they changed over to making it a youth camp, well, 18 to 21 years old, and doing most of the work for the Forest Service, for the rec developments, and wood. And then after that, you know, soon people realize, well, it's a little substandard. It's one of the deadliest mountain highways in Arizona. The death rate was higher than almost anywhere else, 5 times anywhere else in Pima County. So another project that got a whole lot of publicity, but did a whole lot of work, Federal Highways did, starting in the 1980s and not finishing until the mid-2000s. So just about the same length of time as the original construction. Instead of $1 million, it ended up being $75 million. But that's just inflation. But they made the whole thing safer and tried to maintain scenic values all the way. And you know, it was a little frustrating to have the road closures now and then all the way, but they did a great job. One thing we archaeologists didn't like much is they pretty much got rid of all of the fabulous stonework features that were there. Our buddy Chris Schrager is in charge of culvert operations, and these are all near and dear to him. So they're replaced by safer, more wildlife-friendly things, but it's a shame that they're gone. but they didn't make any changes in the alignment of the road and kept it going pretty well. And, he's a fuzzy photo on the left. You can see in this old, when it was there, when they first built it, there were these little fresh tailless slopes. They blasted out, everything just went right over the edge with a 1980s, 90s, 2000s reconstruction. They made an effort to try to revegetate those slopes, make them less of a scar, less visible. You can see here that it looks better. It's still there a bit. Building out a new pullouts, cantilevered out over space. They did a great job. Yeah, and the camp kind of had a slow demise. The Federal Bureau of Prisons checked out in 1967, and they had it arranged for the state of Arizona to take over. And I've read it a number of times. The state took over and ran it as a youth camp. That actually never happened. Looking into it, the Forest Service wanted the state to do it. The feds did, Bureau of Prisons did, and the state was all set. The state juvenile detention folks were all set. They had a guy hired to run it and everything else. And then it got to the state legislature and they say, oh, $100,000, that's way too much. So they pulled the plug on it. So it was empty. The BIA expressed interest and they got approval to take it over, but never got the funding to do it. So it was pretty much abandoned for about 3 years until 1970s when Health, Education, and Welfare gave a grant for $250,000, and a group called became the Southwest Indian Youth Center. They got agreements with many of the tribes in Arizona to send troubled youth there, pre-delinquent, delinquent, kids with issues, alcohol, and it functioned for a little bit, but it never got off the ground. It had problems from the beginning. One, the infrastructure, when the prison camp was going, they had a lot of employees maintaining everything, but it had been empty, and the youth center didn't have the personnel to keep things up. The pipes from Sycamore froze, they had no water, boiler room burned down, supposedly from a lightning strike, although nobody ever saw that. There were charges of abuse, and from the accounts you read, these Indian youths were treated way worse than any of the prisoners that were there ever were treated. Locked into meat lockers and things. Pretty nasty. FBI investigated. With all that going on, the Forest Service declined to renew the lease for the property at the end of 1972. They let them stay on until they found another place in Tucson. But the Forest Service didn't own the buildings. The General Services Administration did. So GSA put out a contract for a request for bids for removal of the buildings, and in the mid 70s they were removed. So it was there. So Forest Service had their spot back and something to do with it. And they eventually got around to doing, well, actually, with that highway reconstruction project there, it was used for several years as a staging area for equipment and materials. So it was off limits to the public and forest for a while. But eventually they decided to do a campground. And it's the Hirabayashi campground. And I was all set to talk a whole lot about more of the prison camp, especially the experiences of the folks that were there in World War II, particularly Dr. Hirabayashi and other Japanese American prisoners who were there. But as I started going through this and realized I've got 2 talks going on here and I only have time for 1 talk, as billed as the highway. So just very briefly about Dr. Hirabayashi. He was a young 24-year-old student at the University of Washington when all the things started happening with Franklin Roosevelt's executive order that established or let the military set up exclusion zones on the West Coast in southern Arizona, and ultimately led to the relocation of 120,000 Japanese Americans Gordon was into pacifism and a member of the Quaker and Friends group, and very conscientious about moral values and citizenship and the Constitution. And he decided deliberately to challenge a couple of those orders that came down. First, the curfew order that Japanese Americans had to be off the street by a certain time, and then the exclusion order to go to relocation camps. And he lost his case in Washington, but Friends and ACLU took up his case and got it to the Supreme Court. And in 1943, the court heard his and two other cases and ruled unanimously against them. And he had to serve his 90-day sentence. He wanted to do somewhere outdoor, a road camp. There weren't any in Washington, the exclusion zone. So he ended up going to Tucson, to the Catalina camp, prison camp. He had to hitchhike there. That's an amazing story. It's been told many times and will be told many times more. Don't have time to go through it here now, sorry. But anyway, he did his time there. For a long time, cohort Mary Farrell and her husband Jeff Burton were working on a big project for the Park Service of evaluating and making an inventory of Japanese American location facilities at that time, and found out that realized Gordon had been there, and so they got excited about that and put forth a proposal to Forest Service to name the new name the place the Gordon Hirabayashi recreation site was originally. Now it's a rec campground. A really interesting thing. 1999, the new name was adopted, a little dedication ceremony. Dr. Hirabayashi in the middle, he recognized Jim Colby, longtime congressman, Southern Arizona, and the forest supervisor, John McGee. It was a good event. 2 years later, Forest Service came up with a new kiosk, interpretive kiosk, and there's another dedication ceremony there. But I'm going to have to let that go for another time. Need another talk. Don't have enough time here. But a great place, and people are in Tucson. A lot of you are going to have some of you are going to have a field trip there this Saturday and visit, and we can talk a whole lot more about it then. But I'm going to leave it for that there for now. So I'm logging off here. Or Al, turning it over to you.
Okay, thank you, Bill. One thing I forgot to mention before I introduce Bill is you're welcome to put questions into the Q&A box, and I will try to forward as many of those to Bill as I can before he decides he doesn't want to answer anymore or we have no more questions. So we do have a few already in the Q&A in the chat. So I would like to go through some of those. First one in the chat, Ben Everett asked, were there prisoners of war at the camp? And you kind of answered that about Gordon. Were there others?
No, there weren't any. Gordon was not a prisoner of war. Can you hear me? I get feedback here. Yeah, there's a lot of misconceptions. You know, it was not an internment camp where Japanese American folks were sent. There were, you know, several, 10 or so great big ones of those, 2 in Arizona that were massive. It was all the way through. It was for people convicted of federal law violations. Gordon was there for specifically for his curfew violation. He challenged the exclusion order, but the Supreme Court neatly worked around that because he had 2 violations, but he was serving not a consecutive sentence, but at the same time, so they could just pick one. So they picked the curfew and said, yeah, he's guilty, and didn't bother with the more serious one. But there were no prison of war. The other Japanese Americans, and you know, love to talk about the group of Hopi Indians that were there. And during World War II, there were mainly folks who didn't want to register for the draft. They were conscientious objectors of whole variety, Mennonites. The biggest group was the Jehovah's Witnesses, you know, for a little time there. And like in 1944 in the fall, fully 75% of the prisoners were selective service violators, draft things. And of the whole camp, over 50% of it was Jehovah's Witnesses. So the composition of the prisoners changed through time. But, you know, it wasn't that, you know, and I remember when, you know, we first put up that kiosk, and some of the first graffiti that showed up was somebody writing, "Tell the truth, this was built by a German prisoner of war." And it wasn't. It didn't happen at all. But it was, you know, ugly graffiti that had to be removed.
Kind of a side question, again, from Ben Everett of Utah. He said, have you seen the prisoners roster at the dam in Lower Sabino Canyon? We referred to it as the wetback monument. The names and prison numbers of the men who worked on the project scratched in wet concrete, dated in the 1950s, I think. I hope it hasn't been lost. You know anything about that?
I'm not sure about at the dam itself. You know, the pump house is gone. I've seen names and numbers. You know, when they built that pipeline up, they put in a whole series of masonry pedestals, so to level out the grade, and some of them are like 10 or 12 feet high, and some of those have names and prisoner numbers in the wet concrete there. They may be down at the dam, and I'm not remembering them. I hope they're there.
Okay, we've gotten a couple of comments that since you teased everybody with this second presentation about Gordon Hirabayashi, I think we have you on the hook now to give us another third Thursday talk, maybe in mid to late 2021, perhaps?
Well, you got to say, you know, when all of this was going on with the Hirabayashi things, I was kind of, I think, probably fourth wheel among my Forest Service colleagues, Mary Farrell, Pete Taylor, Nicole Branton from the archaeology program, and a historian, student at the U of A, Kirsten Lyon, really got involved and worked really hard to do that interpretive science. And, you know, Pete did his thesis, Nicole and Kirsten did their dissertations on this. So there are other people out here that know this really well. And Jeff Bird.
We'll have to start collaborating with some
yeah,
of these
yeah.
folks. Okay.
We'll take turns. That's right, Jeff.
Yeah. Okay, a couple more questions. From Len Reitner, was there any attempt to get the road project to qualify for CCC or WPA support?
No. You know, like I say, the politics of it, it was right at the end of the Hoover administration. Kind of think of it as the last of the old deal projects. So it got going, and it was prison labor all the way from the start, you know, and there were a whole lot of almost every other road project going around was New Deal stuff. And the most prevalent of those locally was that Sabino Canyon, trying to push a road up there to the mythical reservoir that never got built. But that started out with ERA crews, emergency relief, and taken over by the WPA. The CCCs came over and did recreation developments in Sabino. They built a ranger station at Palisades next to the Boy Scout camp. Did a bunch of other things, worked on the Reddington Road, Box Canyon Road, but never did anything with the Catalina Highway.
Okay, you mentioned Peter Taylor. He said, "Great talk, Bill. I look forward to the next one on the resistors." So maybe he'll be the one giving that talk.
Yeah.
Okay, from Richard Stern, great talk. Thanks for presenting. Will you or Al post some references or links to articles or books about the road construction and Dr. Hirabayashi's life history? Can you send me some references and I can send that out to people?
Yeah, you can do that.
Okay. Well, make yourself a note. Okay, Dave Mahalik says, I've seen the term, quote, federal honor camp, end quote, periodically. Was that ever an official name for the prison camp?
No, it wasn't. You know, we called it that for a long time, and you know, that's the way it was on the USGS quad. It's kind of a colloquial thing, and it became popular usage, but it wasn't a designation. It was a prison camp, you know. And sometime we talked to a couple of folks who grew up there with their father working for the prison bureau, and they said nobody ever called it that. It was a prison camp. That's it. But it was also, you know, that term shows up right from the beginning, 1933. Of this is kind of an honor camp, you know, and it gets used frequently all the way through, but it was not an official designation.
Okay, I see some hands raised, so I will come up to those in a minute. Bruce Plank says, were there any sporting events or bicycle races that went over the top of Mount Lemmon and down the control road?
I don't know, but knowing bicyclists, probably, you know, it seems like a natural thing. You know, that's what we're talking about when they got up to Soldier Camp and finished the main project and we're trying to figure out what to do next. There are a lot of people advocated for keep on going down to Oracle, but that lost out and they put their attention to those spur roads and mountaintop recreation instead. And I never heard anything about bicycle at the time, but sporting events were a big thing at the prison camp, both within the camp with basketball, baseball, softball, track and field, everything. But they also welcomed competition with club teams from Tucson in all those sports, and they'd come up and play. I was reading some South Side Mexican-American 16, 17-year-old city League B champions wanted to come up and play the prisoners, and they did and won. But, it was a big thing.
Yeah, maybe they can come up with a mountain version of El Tour de Tucson. Okay, Steve Buck has a question. Steve, I'm going to ask you to unmute here. Go ahead.
Yeah, very interesting presentation. I was wondering, in terms of building the road and the use of the sort of encumbered workers, was there any problem with them versus using regular construction or competition, using prisoners versus using free enterprise?
I don't think that competition was an issue to begin with, and that was, you know, written in the memorandum of agreement of we're doing this because there will be no competition. It was more of an issue with the New Deal program, CCC and WPA. You know, when the CCC was first going through Congress, you know, that was an issue with the AFL-CIO opposed it because, you know, they thought standard wages are $3 an hour or $3 a day, and the CCC was paying $30 a month, and, you know, that's $1 a day and 25 of it going home to their parents. So they argued that that was unfair competition and that the Conservation Corps project shouldn't be approved, but they lost out, and it stopped being an issue pretty fast. With the prisoners, you know, just a little bit more with the prison labor thing. It was anathema to FDR and his administration. One of the bazillion pieces of legislation, or I guess maybe executive order, but he banned the use of labor for road construction projects. But this was already in the book, so it kept going through his long administration.
Excellent. Al, I would add that I'm not sure the date. Maybe by Saturday I will have it. But in an issue of Kiva of the AAHS in the last year or two, there was a very interesting article about construction of the highway. So possibly one can search on Google. KIVA is the name of the publication. And
yeah, I think you may be thinking of the one that was in the Journal of Arizona History.
Oh, okay.
Guy named
Okay.
Zollner. Yeah,
All right, that's right.
Yeah,
Very interesting, very complete.
it was pretty good. Yeah, it's pretty good. A couple of issues. The biggest thing that really worked me when I first picked it up is you got these photos. Oh, look, there's a picture of Bush Ridge, and there are only 3 photos, historic photos attached to that article, and none of them was of the road. They say construction of the Catalina Highway, and it's in Oracle. It's here's the people building a bridge over the CDO, and it's like, is this, I can't. I started thinking I bet it was the editors afterward, and not the author. I hope that's the case anyway, but still, that's not as bad. But with the Journal of Arizona History, to expect something better, like all these fabulous photos, it didn't use any of them. It used the photos
Yeah.
from a different road.
Yeah, that was that professor in California that I asked you to consider bringing up here. He
All
visit
right.
he has his relatives here, and he visits, and he wrote the article.
Yeah, we actually had him scheduled as a speaker before he moved to California.
Yeah.
Going back to Steve's original question, I noticed in one of your slides, Bill, that one of the whereas clauses for building the road did say there would be no competition with private business because the road would not be built if it couldn't be done with personal labor. There's just not enough money for it.
Yeah, that was part of their justification.
Okay, another comment from Walter Keys. Bill, you mentioned camp escapees. Any percentages or numbers of escapees that you know of?
Never gone through and counted them all up. I don't know whether that's recorded somewhere. You read the official accounts. It's just happened every once in a while, but going through newspapers, online things, it really strikes me as there was a news item probably 20 times a year. Maybe not that many escapees. The vast majority of them were Mexican guys taken off. There were a few others as well, but that's enough of that. We can get to the border. Some of them did. A lot of them got picked up right at the bottom. The border patrol would pick them up on the road to Nogales, something, or in Cochise County. But there were a fair number. It was a low security. Didn't talk about it, but they just designated a perimeter, and there's whitewashed a few rocks now and then, and said you can't go past here. But there are no guards. Unlike the internment camps where like the Tucsonians families were, they had a lot more freedom than their people that were in the camps, where there were fences, there was barbed wire, and the guns were pointed inward, not outward.
Okay, Bruce Plink had his hand up. You want to unmute, Bruce?
Yeah, hi. The question I had was, I was confused about the original road that you were talking about that went up Soldier Trail. Is that where the trail is now that starts pretty low down on the existing Catalina Highway? Is that the road that you were talking about?
Yeah, actually, I was panicking this afternoon, realizing I had about 3 hours worth of stuff to talk about. I took out a bunch of slides, and one of them showed the earlier map by Theo White. Did it when he surveyed in the 1870s, and he showed both a trail to Pinery and a road to Pinery, and it's got the legal sections there, so you can tell where it is. And the trail to Pinery is right where the Soldier Trail is now, and has been all that time. The road was on the next ridge just to the west of that, between Soldier Trail and Soldier Canyon. And I don't know if there's any traces of that left at all. Never gone to check it out.
Great, thanks.
Okay. A comment from Sam Heelan. Heelan, hope I'm pronouncing that right. It says, riveting storyteller as always, Bill. Fascinating to learn more about a favorite place. Thank you.
Yeah. Well, hi, Stan. Hi, Walt.
And Tom Skinner says, I agree with Stan. Bill, thanks for an excellent presentation.
Hi, Tom.
Okay, Butch Farabee asks, was anyone killed while building the road?
I don't think so. in contrast to like the CCCs where you had 4 fatalities on building the road from Portal over Onion Saddle alone. I don't think there were fatalities on the road. I also meant to mention about Butch that, you know, that was in that 1933 when they vacated the Boy Scout camp. That was the year he had to stay home and couldn't go up there. That's a joke, by the way.
Okay, Stan remarks, Pinery Road is there. It is part of the Baba Dwag Trail. You can see retaining structures.
Okay.
Okay, I don't see any other questions. Oh, wait a minute, here's some more. Okay, Dave Mahalik again, thank you for organizing this out, and thank you both for a great presentation and great jokes. I think I got most of them.
Well, it's so weird to be sitting here and you don't hear any reaction. I go, oh my God, did I just say something really stupid? You never know.
Yeah, I'll save these questions and answers for you.
Okay.
Okay, anybody else? Okay, well, if not, I'd like to thank Bill for giving, again, an excellent presentation. And again, I would like to ask you and the audience to please consider making a donation to Old Pueblo Archaeology Center, either through our website or you can send us a check. We'd be happy to cash checks. And with that, we'll call it a night. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Is there